This is Eric Humphrey, and along with Dwight Zimler, we've just completed this book, Growth, Modernity, and the Nations of Wealth. It just came out, and as promised, this is the summary for Chapter 4. Chapter 4 in the book is called What is a Theory? But for this cast, we're going to call it Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for the simple reason that we set this up as a kind of conflict between two worlds, a vertical world, the modern world that we live in, that's capable of modern economic growth, and then this other world that coincides exactly with the pre-modern world that doesn't really grow in a modern economic sense. So we call this the basic framework and this modernity. So why do we call this cast Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Well, because we have two strange personalities that come from the same human nature. And in this chapter, we're going to define what we mean by a theory. And a theory is going to want to see this as a unified phenomenon, as a related phenomenon. Hence, we've got to figure out who the personality is. So which side do you want to call Dr. Jekyll and which side Mr. Hyde? I'll leave it up to you, whether you're a fan or a detractor of modernity. But we want to understand how these fit together to form one thing. But before I do that, thinkers about modernity get trapped in what Dwight and I call the four phonos, and that is false ways of knowing that really don't help us understand what the modern world is. The first one is kind of what we'll call fact knowing, and that is you just line up a series of facts and sequence them out. Viking invasions, age of exploration. Just line them up like the Jeopardy contestant or an idiot savant, if you will. That's not really knowing. The second type of knowing is much more prevalent in thinkers, and that is wish knowing. And that is, we state our aspirations instead of a real theory. That is, we aspire to liberate all sorts of people. This would be like leftist thinkers, communist thinkers. And we want to liberate everybody. But this is really a statement of aspirations. It's not really a statement of theory. So this kind of thinking converts all of history into some kind of destiny by God or man. Now, when that kind of thinking fails, we fall into the other kind of false form of knowing, the other kind of phono. Number 3, retrospective knowing. And that relies on the feeling that everything that happens, once it happens, looks obvious because it's happened. And that's the problem with retrospective knowing. It's basically Monday morning quarterbacking. So we'll look at this and say, oh, age of exploration comes up, then they invent glasses. These things are all inevitably have to lead us to modernity. So we exchange the destiny of wishful knowing for the fate of retrospective knowing. That's not really knowing either. But the final kind of knowing, the most dangerous kind, the most rampant in modernity theory, is really just herd knowing. And that is, it's just a mutual affirmation of our identity. And it relies upon the principle that everything seems truer when everyone is shouting in the same direction. But there's no real information exchanged in this. It's like dogs barking or birds chirping. No dog said to another dog, hey, you just barked that yesterday. So there's no real information going on here. So what we mean by knowing in this book is relating, understanding this as a unified phenomenon transparently and rationally, not relying on sequences simply, although facts are important, but coming up with a real theory of how these two worlds relate. So knowing is relating. Aristotle's a beautiful example of this, where he states that knowing is comparing. So once we know how Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde work together, then we'll have the kind of theory that we want. And we can avoid the kind of personalization of theory. That is, modernity was a result of either some sort of God of Genesis creating some sort of intentional model, or when that fails, it's a historical leaf in the wind. We want to avoid those sort of anthropomorphic or anti-anthropomorphic ways of looking at the modern world. So the best kinds of theory relate things together. They unify experience, and that's our goal. So for example, Newton's theory of gravity says that this eraser doing that is doing the exact same thing as what the moon is doing, orbiting the world. It unifies experience down here on Earth and up here in the heavens. Beautiful example of what a theory should do. So if you take this, put a little bit more inertial motion, it carves out a bigger parabola, take it higher, throw it harder, bigger parabola, and then eventually that parabola is going to curl in on itself and form an ellipse and hit you in the back of the head. That's what an orbit is. That's what Newtonian gravitation does. Darwinian theory of evolution is nothing but a theory of the relationships between animals. So the true iconic form of knowing is really the mathematical equation. A mathematical equation is nothing but a series of relationships, a ratio, E equals mc squared. But the problem with math and history is it doesn't work well with complexity. So pure math is true by virtue that it's just a definition with logical consistency. Pure physics works because it's brute simplicity. A hydrogen atom is a hydrogen atom whether it's here or on the far end of the Crab Nebula. It doesn't matter. So 10 tons of Apollo spacecraft headed toward the moon is going to behave with Newtonian theory of gravity just like 10 tons of fudge. It doesn't matter. The equations still work. But the problem in complex reality, historical reality, every reality after chemistry, is we lose this variable control. So we don't really have equations in the true scientific sense or mathematical sense. What we have is what the poets call metaphors. So what are we going to do if we want to talk about a state? A state isn't a state in the same way that a hydrogen atom is a hydrogen atom. So how do we deal with this? Well, to preserve this crucial idea of knowing as relating, what we really want to do is do what other historical sciences have already done, like in economics and biology. And that is you need two things to navigate this big graph. Once you lose this variable control, you need bigger data sets. So we're not going to meditate on how we feel about modernity and just look at the present. We want this big whole swath of experience. And we need better definitions to help us navigate through this experience. So let's take the first example. Just having a bigger data set, a bigger experiential self is going to change dramatically how we see the world. So let's say, for example, the year is 43 BC. Julius Caesar was assassinated a year earlier, and we're in the Roman Forum, and everyone is an average Roman age of about 26. Remember, history is made by very young people. But there's one person in the audience. Mel Brooks' 2,000-year-old man is also in the audience. And the Roman magistrate steps up on the podium and he says, hey, not to worry. This Augustus guy is a little young, a little green, but hey, the gods are smiling. See that comet in the heavens that you've been seeing these nights, that smudge in the sky? That is the gods speaking to you, telling you that everything's okay. That's the soul of Julius Caesar ascending to heaven. Everyone in the audience says, well, it sounds good to me. That explains it. So we're in good hands. And then the 2,000-year-old man gets up and said, beg your pardon, Dominus, magistrate. I've seen that smudge in the sky before about 20 times now. It's not Julius Caesar's soul. It's some sort of mechanical repeating phenomenon. So you can see just by experience, bigger data, that we can look at the world very differently. Whereas if we look at it in an isolated way, it looks more spontaneous. So we think we need to evoke the complex and puzzling thing maker to explain complex and puzzling things. But with wider spans of experience, we can see different kinds of patterns. New patterns start to emerge. Similarly, if you want to look at life on Earth, if you take the average natural philosopher or scientist or intellectual in the year 1500 in the West, they thought the world was about 5,000 years old. Now, about every generation after that, up to the year 2000, that age of the world doubles as they try and figure out how this world works. So now scientists believe it's about 5 billion years old. So what you find in the fossil record is distinctly not what Aristotle or the Bible might have predicted, old MacDonald's farm animals all the way down. But this bigger swath of experience enables you to try and find out what you really do see. And it's more like what Johnny Carson would say, a lot of weird and wild stuff. It's just strange material down there. And in that span of time, one could see a different kind of pattern for the emergence of life. We don't need to evoke the complex and puzzling thing maker to explain complex and puzzling things. But similarly, we don't need to surrender to the opposite of an anthropomorphic interpretation, and that is that pure chance generated it. You don't make frogs with blenders. That's not what evolutionary theory is. So how does that pertain to our problem here? Well, This, our big graph, what graphs human GDP per capita for the last 7,000 years, is nothing but big data. It's a big picture of what humans have been doing for the last 99.9 yards of their existence. So we have, by definition, not a meditation on this modern moment absorbed in the present, but all kinds of humans here. Ultimately, what we're going to argue is that the general theory of economics is here, and this modern period is not the general theory like most economists think, but some sort of special case, some sort of unusual kind of case. So the second thing we need when we lose variable control is better fundamental definitions. And this is a very important point, and we're going to emphasize this point in the next chapter, chapter 5. This just deals with the kinds of definitions we're going to need to explain this graph. But what's really important here is Dwight and I want to really emphasize the point that a lot of misunderstanding the modern world is less about the facts we're using, but about the assumptions we use to put those facts together. We're using the wrong kinds of fundamental definitions. And any theory, the better part of any theory, is simply its definitions. They tell us how to assess matter, how to weight facts. Consider the difference between astrology and astronomy. So astrologers believe that the world is speaking to them. They look at the same stars as astronomers do, but they believe those stars are talking to them. And they use this knowledge of the future that they get from talking to stars not to play the market and get rich, but to help us with our relationships. And now that's true altruism. Whereas the astronomers explain the world by mechanism. So the difference between these worlds is not the stars, it's the assumptions they use to explain the stars. So that's why definitions are so important. They teach us to weight information, to figure out what's important, what isn't, to distinguish between what Clausewitz might call the fog of war, or what a market trader might say, a market going sideways. They tell us how to pay attention to things. So, for example, in most modernity theory, the phenomena of nationalism is treated very episodic, like a particular falling rock. This person used nationalism for sinister motives over here. But that's an occasion of nationalism. That's not a theory of why nationalism is breaking out all over Europe as a way of organizing human beings. So these treatments of nationalism, unlike the treatment in our book, treat nationalism as an occasion of effect rather than a theory that stems from nationalism. So we want to get the larger theory. We want to treat the cause of nationalism, not a momentary occasion of it. That's the bigger kind of theory that we want. So we've got what we need in this chapter. We've defined what we have to do. We have to see this as a unified view, one phenomenon. We've got our big data set, so we're not going to obsess like most modernity theories in the present. And then we've raised the matter of the kinds of definitions that we'll need to make this work. And that is so important that we've devoted the entirety of next chapter. Thank you.